Okay, we got the thumbs up. So my name's Mark Carabetta. I'm an environmental scientist with SLR. I'm going to be joined by my colleagues, Miguel and Matt, who will introduce themselves as we go along. And the title of our talk is You Can't Step into the Same River Twice, and we'll explain what we mean by that. And then we're going to give an overview of the work we've been doing as part of the Resilient New York program. So the title comes from this quote from Heraclitus, a Greek philosopher, who says, no man, and we'll give him the benefit of the doubt and assume he means people, but no man ever steps into the same river twice, for it's not the same river and he's not the same man. So we thought it was kind of a thought-provoking quote and kind of highlights the fact that a river is constantly changing and people are constantly changing. And over time, humans have drastically altered rivers. And now in a time of a rapidly changing climate, those changes of rivers are affected even more. We thought it was a good sort of framework for our presentation here today. So a little bit about the Resilient New York program. It's an initiative of the New York State DEC. Our firm, SLR, we're formerly known as Milone and McBroom, was contracted to tackle flood hazard mitigation studies throughout the eastern half of the state under this program, and another firm was hired to handle the western half. And the watersheds that you see there on the screen represent the watersheds where we've been conducting these studies. The sort of the pink color are completed studies, and some of these actually go back prior to the origins of this program. And then the green watersheds are studies that are currently underway. The tan ones are kind of on deck. We'll be handling those over starting them in the next few months, and then the blue are still to come. And the goal of the program is to make New York State more resilient to future flooding and climate change. And we do this through flood and ice jam studies in each of these watersheds and developing flood mitigation and ice jam mitigation recommendations that'll make the state more resilient to future flooding and climate change. There is a web page set up within DEC's website that gives an overview of the program and the study watersheds, and there are links to completed studies. And you could follow that link at the bottom, or you could Google Resilient New York program, and you'll arrive at it. This is an introduction to our team at SLR. Some of us out in some of our study watersheds, either doing our work or playing, fishing. I'll step through the process. This is a typical process we go through for one of these flood studies. We begin with a data collection phase, where and a very important component of these studies, where we get out and talk to experts, witnesses of flooding. This is often a particular, say, highway department staff who's very knowledgeable about the flooding that has occurred in these communities in the past. It's often an emergency responder who has responded to people being stranded by flooding and is able to give us lots of information. It's often watershed groups, and really this is a very important component so that people understand what we're doing and we're able to draw on this information. Then we call on lots of resources that are available in the watersheds, whether they're stream gauge data, previous FEMA studies, FEMA hydraulic modeling, all kinds of previous studies that we pull in. And we identify what we call high hazard or high risk areas within each watershed where the flooding problems occur repeatedly or are most prevalent, and that's where we really focus our analysis. These photos were taken from back in the days when we used to meet in person and gather around maps, and it was a lot of fun sort of hearing from community members. We draw on the maps where flooding had occurred and the flow paths. Today with COVID, it's more likely that we will be meeting sort of in a online setting such as this, but hopefully someday we'll transition back to this sort of setting. So then we go on to the field stage where we get out in the field, take a lot of measurements. We do a geomorphic assessment of the channel. we measure bridges and culverts, and we conduct hydraulic modeling, which is really the primary tool we use to get at these the development of these flood mitigation and ice jam mitigation strategies. And then we go on and develop our report and make recommendations to the community that could then be implemented in funding and constructed. This is an example of a stream gauge, a USGS stream gauge, which has been recording peak flow information for over 100 years. This particular gauge is on the east branch of the Delaware River, right at Fish's Eddy. And you can see the different peak flow events. We've put dates on some of them there. And then the horizontal lines show the FEMA 10-year and 50-year and 100-year flood event. So you can see where each flood, its magnitude. So the 2006 flood, for example, exceeded the FEMA predicted 100-year flood event. It's really useful to have stream gauge information that goes back this far, over 100 years. It allows you to do statistical analysis on those floods and calculate with quite a bit of certainty the magnitude of the 10-year flood or the 50-year flood, and also look at changes over time. I mean, some important factors here: in 1954, the Papacton Reservoir was constructed on the east branch of the Delaware River, and that of course had an influence because the big reservoir acts to attenuate flood flows. And of course, over 100 years, there's a lot of land use change in the watershed, which affects flows. So very valuable to have good stream gauge information, which isn't always available in all watersheds. We are also working in a changing climate. This map shows, this is just a snapshot showing average precipitation over the year, comparing two different periods, generally showing how wet areas are getting wetter and dry areas of the country are getting drier. And also wet seasons are getting wetter and dry seasons are getting drier. And just now I added the photograph to the left to this presentation, and that's my rain gauge this morning after the nor'easter that came through yesterday and resulted in a lot of this flooding with about 3 3/4 inches of rain in a 24-hour period. So how do we try and accommodate for a changing climate as we do these flood studies? A lot of hydrologic information in the past has only looked at the past and not really considered projected future increases in flows. So we come up with these future flows in a number of ways, and then we implement it in our plans. The image to the left, this is a profile on the east branch, the west branch of the Delaware River, showing a series of bridges, and we're kind of evaluating them to see how they pass flood flows. And we're able to look not just at current flows, but at future predicted flows under different greenhouse gas scenarios. And it gives us a sense looking forward of whether those bridges will be able to pass future flows. And then on the right is a floodplain map, and we're able to sort of remap the floodplains using future flows and see how the size of the floodplain expands in a larger magnitude flood under a future flow condition. We try and start our studies looking at a very large scale before we dive into the details. And this map shows the physiographic regions of New York State. And I could superimpose on this map a few of the watersheds we've been working in on these flood studies. And we're going to kind of walk you through each of these watersheds and some of the results and the analysis we've been doing. And the watersheds, and similar to the ones you saw on the map at the introduction, they range from north to south and from large to small, mountainous to flat, urban to rural. And depending on the landscape setting, whether we're in the mountains, sometimes, for example, way up north, there's ice jamming is a large issue, whereas down in Rockland County, often urbanization is a big issue that contributes to flooding. So really, depending on where you are in your setting, there's different questions that you're grappling with and different hurdles. So we're going to start with the East Branch Delaware River, and I'm going to turn the slides over to Miguel to step us through that. actually, I am going to talk about this next slide before I hand it over. This is a stream order map. And so stream order just works a headwater stream, which you see in blue on this map, is a first order stream. And once it's joined by another first order stream, it becomes a second order stream, and so on. It remains a second order stream till it's joined by another second, becomes a third. And this is sort of a quick and easy way to give an indication of river size. So the East Branch of the Delaware River would be a 6th order stream where it leaves the state of New York there in Hancock. And some of its tributaries, you see there are 5th order. And the table at the top shows, it kind of gives a sense of most of the stream mileage in a watershed is 1st and 2nd order streams. Those high order streams make up most of the river miles. And they are also much steeper than the 5th or 6th order streams. And this will change. Those relationships will change when you get into a different type of watershed, a flatter watershed, or one that has less miles of stream. This is a relief map showing that same river system. And this is this is one of my favorite images, very dramatic, sort of incised river system shaped by glaciers. And you have that very flat main stem of the East and West Branch of the Delaware River with very steep tributaries coming into it. And this shows that same system as a profile. So we have the East Branch of the Delaware River at a fairly flat slope, slightly more than 0.1%. Then you have these very steep tributaries coming in all along its reach. This is the Tailwater section of the East Branch of the Delaware River, which is downstream of the Papacton Dam there, Papacton Reservoir. And in this sort of setting, we have lots of sediment being carried by these steep tributaries, which then gets deposited in that main stem right at the confluence. And the main stem, because it's flat, doesn't have the competence or the stream power to move that sediment along. And we end up with an alluvial fan and sediment aggradation at that main stem, right where a lot of the early settlements occurred, right at these confluences. So with that as kind of a setting, I'm going to now turn things over to Miguel so we could talk a little more about our work here.
Right. So I'll just be stepping through a couple slides detailing the flood study that we conducted on Downs Brook. So as Mark mentioned, it's one of the many steep tributaries that enters the East Branch just downstream of the New York City Papacton Reservoir. Myself and Matt were tasked with creating a hydraulic model for the watercourse to assess mitigation alternatives. Before showing the model, I'll just step through a bit of the watershed conditions that we were tasked with for this particular study. So it's just an aerial showing Downs Brook. It's got a drainage basin of 27 square miles when measured at the confluence with the East Branch, which is shown at the bottom of this slide. The land cover within the watershed is predominantly forested with some agricultural land use throughout. The main populous center of the watershed is the Hamlet of Downsville, which is located where Downs Brook enters the flat valley floor and meets with the East Branch. The community here was built atop a very active depositional feature that we call an alluvial fan. There's a picture of this shown on the top left of this slide. It's typically a very dynamic environment with channel migration being very common, and multi-thread channels are very typical of this setting. The next slide is a zoom in of the Hamlet just near the confluence. We have Downs Brook draining north to south through the community in a very narrow and straightened section of channel, which is, kind of the opposite of what we saw in that previous example that I was showing of an alluvial fan. Historically, these tributaries, as we saw across the whole East Branch watershed, the tributaries have been straightened, dredged out, and encroached upon by settlement, which has unraveled a series of issues with incision and entrenchment, in this area specifically, you can even see that there's a buildup of a sediment bar just at the confluence where Downs Brook enters the East Branch. These impaired sections of streams are pretty unstable and produce high velocity just due to the confined nature of them. And the communities are at greater risk of damage during flood from loss of roads or washouts and overall just erosion. In the next slide, we have just the FEMA digital flood insurance rate map superimposed over the aerial, showing the extent of flooding with the 100 and 500 years consuming a lot of the populated area here in Downsville along Main Street. Flooding can come from either the tributary, so Downs Brook, or the East Branch, or a combination of both. And as we were looking more into this, it became apparent that this was very like a complex hydrologic and hydraulic setting. And it warranted a 2D or two-dimensional hydraulic model to better be able to simulate different flood events and better model the flow paths of the alluvial fan setting. The next slide is just a short clip. If Mark can press play. So this is like the 2D model in action. It might be a little slow and laggy. I'm sorry about that. But we can see that the flooding starts just upstream of the Main Street Bridge there. This is a 10-year flood event on the Downs Brook tributary with a 720 cubic feet per second release on the Papacton, or downstream of the Papacton Reservoir on the East Branch. So very neat results that we use to basically pinpoint the problem areas here on this tributary in this complex setting. Using the model output allowed us to break apart the situation and pinpoint exactly where flood mitigation efforts could be optimized and should be prioritized. This next slide shows our final recommendations that we came up with, the improvements that included upsizing the undersized bridge on Main Street and also some floodplain enhancements wherever there was room available. The settlements or the development had really encroached upon the stream here with buildings just adjacent to the stream on the banks. So we recommended some relocations in the vicinity where those property relocations really warranted the benefits of in flood reduction. So here it's worth mentioning that the floodplain bench enhancements that were being recommended really aim to not impede or reduce the overall sediment transfer capabilities of the stream itself. And we're not just, over widening the stream to help alleviate flood. Then the next slide is showing the existing 50-year flood event on the Downs Brook, with the similar kind of condition on the tailwater on the East Branch, which is a release of 720 CFS. Here we see, in comparison with the 10-year clip that we just saw, and during the 50-year, there's more extensive flooding along Main Street, really consuming a lot of homes and businesses in that area now. Then in the next slide, we're showing the same flood event, but with proposed conditions now implemented. So we'll just toggle back and forth between these next two slides, which demonstrate once those floodplain bench enhancements have been implemented and the bridge itself has been replaced, we see a lot of flood reduction in the main populated area of Downsville. And then the last slide that I just have here is showing a slightly just different scenario. It's basically the proposed conditions model, but now it's running with the East Branch at a flood stage, which really impacts the most southern reach of Downs Brook. And one of the reasons why we decided to end the floodplain bench, where we decided to terminate it and not carry it further downstream was because at a point, the floodplain bench, the effects and the benefits are no longer there because you do have a very active and regularly inundated floodplain on the East Branch, and it didn't really reap the benefits in that case. And that's pretty much a very quick recap of our flood study on the Downsbrook.
Okay, now we're going to jump down to Rockland County and give an example here. This is Minisceongo Creek, which is in Rockland County, as I said, and it flows to the Hudson River estuary. This is a watershed map showing land use, the land uses within the watershed, and you could see, compared to East Branch Delaware River watershed, which Miguel just talked about, much more urbanized setting. But even within that watershed, you could see the upper watershed is largely forested, whereas the lower parts of the watershed and that South Branch portion is much more developed. We're going to be talking about the area in Garnerville called the Garnerville Arts and Industrial Center. This is a Civil War era, originally a textile mill that is now a combination of light industry and artisans, galleries. There's a brewery there and a coffee roasters. But you could see Minisceongo Creek flows right in between the buildings and under the buildings, sort of through the buildings. And these are some photos taken of the Arts Center during and after Tropical Storm Irene. You can see the extent of damage here in the photo on the right. So I'm going to now turn things over to Matt Trueheart, who's going to talk a bit more about our modeling here on Minisceongo.
Okay. So you can see there's quite a bit going on here, as Mark was saying. We've got 3 buildings that span the creek as it flows between the Rose and the Arts and Industrial Center. Immediately upstream is a 16 or 17 foot high dam. Then there's a bridge that spans just upstream of the dam, and then a relatively small impoundment with depositional issues at the head of the impoundment, which are instigating lateral migration and bank failure in the Church Street neighborhood towards the upstream side. So again, this was worthy of a 2-dimensional model due to the complexity of the setting. So the next slide would show the existing conditions in the 100-year flood. And as you can see, the banks are overtopped on the left or to the north upstream of the dam, and affect the roadways and homes and properties and businesses in the Arts Center. Flows also escape on the right bank between the buildings. Obviously, this is not accounting for debris jamming or anything like that that could further exacerbate the flooding elsewhere. So we looked at a few things here as far as flood mitigation. Now, typically you'd investigate removing a dam in this situation, but it's a pretty significant part of the aesthetic and character of the Arts Center, and sometimes it's just not practical, despite what you may want to do. So what we actually found was that this building that's circled here in orange, this is a newer building that was built later than the rest of this sort of mill race area, is just about 40 feet downstream of this dam, and interferes with the hydraulics of the spillway and the jump that would form downstream. Now, the owners of this building have been considering removing it already because as you can see, there's 2 rows of piers underneath it that cause chronic debris jamming, even in low flows, wood and such things, tree trunks and whatnot. They're sort of a nuisance, cause nuisance flooding, and obviously bigger issues in the major floods. And what we found was that by removing just that section of that building, you would reduce flooding depths upstream in the impoundment by 2 feet or more. And it's unusual to see influence of a structure from downstream of a 16 or 17 foot high dam extend up and above. But that's what we were seeing here. And so if you step to the next slide, we can see this is sort of just a concept of a proposed condition here, which really just involves removing that that building, and then at the upstream end where there's currently a public park, adding some floodplain enhancement to help alleviate some of the high velocity flows that are coming in from a relatively straight and steep reach of channel upstream. And so we've just got the sort of before and after here, where this is what we had just seen, the 100-year flood. And then with those proposed changes, the removal of the building, and then the upstream floodplain enhancement, you see quite a bit of a change. You keep the flows confined in the channel where it was intended to be and alleviate quite a bit of flooding. This also helps bring the dam into regulatory compliance, as it's supposed to be able to pass the 100-year flood with freeboard based on its hazard class. So the other thing that we saw here was when the impoundment level and flood conditions is lowered with these treatments, it brings the depositional zone at the head of impoundment farther downstream, and further helps alleviate the conditions up at the current bank failure site. So moving about 300 miles north, we'll look at the Great Chazy watershed and consider some ice jamming conditions, as Mark had mentioned. So we'll look at 2 areas near the Lake Champlain, one being the village of Champlain and the other being the area known as Perry Mills, upstream of the Whiteside Dam that's called out there. So first we'll look at the Perry Mills area, and just an overview here. There's a bridge at the upstream end. The head of the impoundment reaches nearly to the bridge within just a few hundred feet. You can see couple islands and some evidence of aggradation at the head of the impoundment there too. About 7,000 feet downstream is the Whiteside Dam, which was built in 1909. And during ice jamming events, what we see, these are, as Mark mentioned, emergency services are often great resources in these studies. This was from the Clinton County Department of Emergency Services, taking a helicopter tour during an ice jam. And what you can see is breakup ice accumulating at the Creek Road Bridge here in Perry Mills. Got a shot of it at the ground there. And I've got a house circled in orange on the top left that I want you to take note of in the next photo, which there's that house. And what we're looking at here is the head of the impoundment. So on the right side of the image, on the downstream side, that is solid, thick ice that's formed in the stagnant impoundment. In some cases, it's anchored to the bed or to these trees. And when the breakup ice moves from upstream, it's got nowhere to go. It hits the shallows that are formed due to deposition behind the dam, as well as this solid ice that's not really going anywhere anytime soon. And so looking on downstream, this is just a view looking farther and farther, and you can see that the ice is locked up all the way to the dam, circled in red in the upper right photo. So when that ice does release, it heads on downstream towards the village of Champlain. And so I guess worth noting here that, let's see, in 21 of the last 25 years, at least one ice jam has been reported in the cold regions ice jam database at Perry Mills or in the village of Champlain. So this is happening regularly. And we've got photos from the same event here, where we're looking at the village of Champlain. We'll kind of step through this big horseshoe bend that goes through the village. But you can see the truss bridge in the bottom left has been closed off with cones. You can see ice is rafted upstream of it. And that this whole area sort of in the center right of the frame has been heavily damaged by ice rafting. It's sort of filling the whole area. So we'll just keep stepping around the corner here. You can see we started to really build up ice as we're coming around. Then moving on down, here's the next bridge. And we can see that essentially the same phenomenon is happening here, where in the top right, you can see solid, thick, potentially anchored ice. Except in this case, it's not formed in the stagnant waters of a dam impoundment. That's actually the tailwater of Lake Champlain itself, which is 5 miles away. So when this ice hits, it's got, it's not powerful enough to break up that ice and builds up there. So we did some modeling of this in HEC-RAS. We had a one-dimensional model that we added. Oh, excuse me, my headset's acting up. Is that working?
You're back.
Okay, great. Sorry about that, guys. So we generally, or often anyway, ice jamming occurs during a bankful flow or a 2-year flood, relatively minor discharge associated with a freshet or a warm period or a early thaw in January, that type of thing. And what you can see, we sort of calibrated these and parameterized the ice jamming based on these photographs we got from the emergency services in Clinton County, which were wonderful. So you can see how much the ice builds up at these bridges in Champlain and then upstream at Perry Mills. And so when we're looking at mitigation options, the Whiteside Dam is actually currently only purpose is as a lamprey barrier for excluding sea lamprey from migrating up from Champlain. And it's a 9-foot high dam, but as I'm not going to read through all of this, but essentially a 2-foot high drop is generally sufficient to achieve lamprey exclusion. So the recommendation here is to, if the natural bedrock falls at that location is sufficient to keep out the lamprey, then take the dam out. Otherwise, modify or replace the dam with sort of the minimum acceptable structure height. So because we can't get rid of Lake Champlain downstream of the village of Champlain, we sort of need to propose something a little more extensive. So what we've got here is 2 bridge replacements, 6 property buyouts, and some floodplain enhancement. And in this case, because the tailwater of Champlain actually extends to about that horseshoe bend, this has very limited flood mitigation benefit, but these floodplain enhancements provide large areas for ice rafting or ice rafts to accumulate where they otherwise would build up in the entrenched channel. So on the next slide, we can see that same bankful flood event with ice jamming under this proposed condition, which, while it's still deeper flooding depths than Clearwater conditions, you can see you avoid the ice rafting into the village as well as damage to these bridges. And that's it.
Okay, so we're going to talk one final watershed, and I see we're running short on time, so I'll just go quickly through this. But this is Steel Creek, which is a tributary to the Mohawk River in the village of Ilion. And this is an example we wanted, so we've shown you our studies, and we really wanted to show one example of where a study led to a design of a project and then implementation and construction of a project. So this area of Ilion, as you could see in sort of the paragraph from a New York State Department of Health document from 1894, this flooding issue in Ilion has existed for a very long time. And the dam that was part of this project dates, it relates to the Remington Arms Company. That was a pre-Civil War era facility. And the dam and construction relating to the dam sort of made this a very flood prone area of creek. And then the village built up all around it over time. So you had these residential neighborhoods and streets that were flooded on a regular basis. So after our study, which took place in 2014, a lot of the recommendations were carried forward into project design, and the project entailed buyouts of residential properties, removal of roads, the removal of the Remington Arms Dam, lowering of the channel that had built up behind the dam about 13 feet, and properly sizing that channel and creating and restoring floodplain along that channel. And then there were some secondary sort of infrastructure components, a replacement of a bridge, and then the installation of a sanitary pump station to take place of a gravity sewer that had crossed under the creek. These are a few slides of the Remington Arms Dam being removed, sort of before, during, and after. In the center, you can see the hollow core Amberson style dam. And then just a couple of components, the original bridge on the left, the Richfield Street Bridge, which is approximately 40 feet in span, was replaced by the one on the right, which would now pass the 100-year flood plus the future flows with freeboard, a span of approximately 80 feet. And then on the bottom, an unfortunate component was that a fairly new bridge that was undersized crossed this channel, and we had to work around that by basically deepening the channel under the bridge. You could see that's Miguel standing under the bridge on the left, and then on the right, you've got a full excavator under there. So we've deepened the channel. It's still very much a lateral constriction in the channel, but it now passes the future 100-year flood event. This is a depth grid map prior to the project. You could see that neighborhood, especially to River Right, the river is flowing north here, extensively flooded. And then that is post-project with a great reduction in flooding throughout. So one final thing I wanted to say, we've shown some examples of a lot of projects that solve a lot of flooding problems, but that's not always the case. And I want to emphasize sort of a managing expectations. In many cases, we find there's flooded neighborhoods or flood-prone structures where the only solution is managed retreat, to move those houses out of harm's way and out of that flood-prone area, which is often the only solution. And with that, we'll end. Just a few acknowledgments to the people you see listed here, and many others in all the watersheds that we work in.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark, Matt, and Miguel, for your presentation. We have time for just one question which came in, and I'm going to maybe combine two questions that came in that are similar. So the question is, were these communities and landowners receptive to the recommended actions to enhance floodplains and increase safety and resilience? And was there anything that you did in the front end of the process that involved stakeholder engagement, how you involved elected officials or watershed groups or landowners in the process so that they came along with the plan and the recommendations?
I guess I could start with the second part of the question first. When we start the stakeholder engagement, and we get a lot of help from the soil and water districts or people working in the watersheds to try and engage with as many people who experience the flooding as we can. We invite them to join the call. And we run through a presentation that's actually very similar to this one, that explains what we're doing, what the goals are, and shows them some projects that have actually gone through to construction and implementation, so they understand this isn't just a study that's going to sit on a shelf. It kind of opens the door to funding possibilities, and communities that have chosen to adopt these recommendations have been successful in implementing them. And it's really at the point where we finish our study, it becomes the sort of the ownership of the community owns the recommendations. They could choose to implement them or not, depending on whether the landowners choose to go forward with it as a community. So I guess the first part of the question about landowners, whether they've been receptive, it's kind of been a mixed bag. I think we could probably talk for a long time about specific projects, but I think generally, if people understand what their risks are, I think they're more likely to agree to some solution down the road, if you give them a realistic understanding of the risk and then the solution. And obviously a community in and of itself isn't often able to handle the costs of these projects, and they have to look elsewhere through grants or to the state or federal funding and FEMA buyouts and that sort of thing. That the example on Steel Creek, there were probably 5 or 6 different funding streams for those projects, plus some funding directly from the village of Ilion. So these are pretty complicated undertakings and multiple funding streams for a project of that scale. So hopefully I've answered that question.
That's great. And maybe
Yeah.
a third question that came in also answered.
Oh, I was just going to say another thing to consider there is when we're making these recommendations, we're trying to do as much as we can to solve as big of problems as we can. And it's, you can walk that back if you need to. But what we try to see is what can reasonably be done. And go from there.